Hey everyone, and welcome back to Dawn Nerds. I'm your host Charlie, and today I'm bringing you the Silent Hill 2 Remake review. So Silent Hill 2 Remake is a highly anticipated reimagining of the 2001 psychological horror classic that was developed by Team Silent back in the day. This time it's being developed by Bloober Team, who previously worked on such titles as Layers of Fear or The Medium, if any of you got to play those. They're very, very good horror games. And it retains the emotional core and twisted atmosphere that made the original game a timeless masterpiece, whilst at the same time managing to introduce a host of modern updates that bring it into the newest generation of consoles. And in this review, we'll delve into various aspects of the remake to give a balanced look at its strengths and areas where it might fall a little bit short. The story and setting. The core story of Silent Hill 2 remains unchanged from the 2001 version, and this is a good thing for those of us that have played the 2001 original. The game follows the story of James Sunderland, who's drawn back into the eerie town of Silent Hill after receiving a letter from his deceased wife. From that point, James embarks on a psychological journey through his trauma, guilt and grief, with Silent Hill's mist-shrouded streets and monstrous inhabitants serving as the haunting manifestations of his inner psyche and all of the things he's currently dealing with. Bloober Team has done an excellent job of preserving the complex narrative. For players new to the franchise, the story is one of the most compelling aspects of the game. It's the reason why we all loved the original. There's layered symbolism and emotional depth hidden all the way throughout the town, the characters, and in the actual game itself. The small town of Silent Hill is as much of a character as James, with its unsettling fog and decaying architecture that pulls you deeper into the mystery and intrigue. However, we presume that not every character sees the town the same way as James does, with it being a manifestation. Laura, who's the little girl that you meet throughout the game, seems pretty casual in regards to how our small child might act or react in such a situation if she was seeing everything that James was that was going on around her. Either way, whilst the core story remains faithful, some new dialogues and minor narrative tweaks have been introduced, mostly that just extend a few scenes and add overall a bit of a better experience for the players. And these changes, although generally subtle, don't stray too far from the original's intent that they were aiming for. Some of the purists out there, though, might argue that the changes weren't really necessary, but they don't really detract from the overall experience of the game itself. Graphics and visual updates. One of the most anticipated aspects of the Silent Hill 2 remake was the visual overhaul, and in this department the game does not disappoint. It's built currently on the Unreal Engine 5, and the game takes full advantage of the modern hardware to deliver stunning atmospheric visuals that bring the foggy town to life like we always imagined back in 2001. There's paper that floats down the street, there's trash that litters the streets, broken cars, decaying walls all falling apart, generally giving the town itself that once kind of lived in look that I felt was missing on the OG PS2 version. Everywhere looked a bit barren, but also kind of gave it a bit of atmosphere as well. So both kind of play to their strengths, which is really good. The thick fog signature element of Silent Hill, if you're playing a Silent Hill game, you know there's going to be fog, has been hugely improved with volumetric effects, so making it feel a bit more dynamic and oppressive as you're playing through. And with that, the lighting plays a huge role in amplifying the horror, the ray tracing allowing for realistic reflections and shadows, and the abandoned buildings, cracked streets and grotesque enemies are rendered in much greater detail, making the environments feel both familiar but unsettlingly new at the same time. This is especially true when James finally gets a hold of the trusty flashlight off the mannequin, and from that point on, the game becomes truly dark, and it captures that sense of impending darkness swallowing James whole. You'll find that the edges of the screen feel a lot darker, the environments that you're in feel darker, and if it wasn't for the flashlight, the screen would pretty much be black. Character models have been overhauled hugely, especially the main characters that you meet. The mannequins, weirdly enough, feel very similar to the original. They've managed to capture that very well. But the facial expressions and the body language are far more expressive on all the main characters, making the scenes much more impactful, much more emotional. And I know some fans have expressed that the updated character models lack the same uncanny valley feel that the original had, which contributed to that kind of cult classic tone that the game was going for. But it was a game of its time, and for players who are new, the original kind of will always hold that place. Whereas the new actor, I felt, has brought a new sense of depth, and his acting and subtle movements and his emotion in his face portrays James in a way that we never could have imagined. Again, this is a subjective matter, but overall, with realism and attention to detail in the graphics, are undoubtedly impressive throughout for all of the characters portrayed in the game. Gameplay and mechanics. So the core gameplay of Silent Hill 2 remains largely the same as the original. It's pretty much completely unchanged, which is both a strength and a limitation. The remake retains its exploration, like kind of heavy design. You're always going to be exploring throughout the town. That is, as I said, it's almost a character in itself. And as you progress, you're solving puzzles, fighting or evading monsters to progress through the Silent Hill's foggy streets and the ominous buildings to find the truth behind the letter that James received. Combat has seen a huge improvement, particularly in the fluidity of the movement and the camera controls, opting for an over-the-shoulder view, like that seen in the Resident Evil remakes. If any of you have played those games recently, you will know what I'm talking about. In the original, combat was clunky as anything, which made the player feel much more vulnerable, but it also gave James that sense that he truly has ended up in hell, whereas this one kind of smooths it out more, with like the rough edges and everything like that, without making James feel overpowered. So even though it's more fluid, James still feels vulnerable as a character. So it strikes that decent balance. Enemies can still overpower James, and often they'll hide in the shadows round the corner. You'll get a glimpse of them, they'll disappear, and then they'll jump out to the players when they're least expecting it. However, those expecting a hugely radical reinvention of the combat system might feel that the tweaks are relatively minor, but they're just enough to make sure that it doesn't take away too much from the overall gameplay. The radio also returns with its static volume ever increasing the closer to enemies the player gets, although I will say I enjoy the game much more with the radio off. I feel like it heightened the senses and made me much more aware of just running into a room and letting the game tell me that the enemies were present. It very much reminded me of grounded mode in The Last of Us, where like the echolocation is turned off and you're relying primarily on your senses as the player and what you can see, rather than being told an enemy is here, this is an encounter coming up. And luckily enough, they actually related it to a trophy as well, which is great. On to the puzzles, a significant part of Silent Hill 2's gameplay. These remain true to the original, with some additional hints for new players in how to solve them or places to visit to progress your understanding of how to solve them. Long-time fans will likely appreciate that the puzzles retain their challenging nature, but newcomers may find some of them unintuitive by today's standards and expect it to be dumbed down a little bit more to enable them to progress. However, I found that at no point did I not know where to go or what to do, because luckily James marks a lot of the locations and hints and clues on the map that players can then pursue. In the game itself, there are accessibility options such as the customizable control schemes and the difficulty settings for both combat and puzzles. So you can kind of tweak the game to your liking. If you maybe want the combat to be harder but the puzzles to be easier, you can choose that, and that makes it a lot more approachable to a broader audience, and they can kind of choose how they want to play the game. They've included a few new gameplay features regarding filters that can be applied to the game to make it look like the original 2001 version, although realistically they don't actually add anything significant to the game. Difficulty and accessibility. The original Silent Hill 2 was known for its balance between difficult combat and intricate puzzles, and in the remake, as I mentioned, difficulty options are exactly as expected for a Silent Hill game. You can choose them however you want and tailor your experience to kind of match that and suit how you want to play. On lower combat difficulties, enemies are a lot less aggressive and easier to defeat, allowing players who want to focus on the story to do so without much of a challenge. And on higher difficulty levels, enemies are much more relentless. They will hide more, they will chase you down more, and resources like health items and ammunition are a lot scarcer. So it maintains that sense of dread and survival tension. So if you're the type of player that, as I mentioned, would prefer the combat to be lighter but the puzzles to be harder, that is an option that you can do, which is great. In terms of the actual accessibility features, I already mentioned the customizable controls. The game does have subtitles and the colorblind options, which I thought was very good that they included that. You can obviously change the text size. You can have it so it's dyslexic friendly, which again I haven't seen in many games. So it was nice to see that featured in here. But it's nowhere near the level of Naughty Dog's like accessibility that they put into, say, The Last of Us. Again, to do that comparison. Audio and soundtrack. The audio design in Silent Hill 2 Remake is easily the game's most standout feature. The original game's sound design, led by Akira Yamaoka, was instrumental in creating like its eerie atmosphere. The guy is considered an absolute legend in the horror field, particularly with Silent Hill. And the remake builds on that foundation with updated audio fidelity all the way throughout. The iconic soundtrack, the do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do that you hear, the haunting piano themes and the ambient tracks have all been remastered, but not drastically altered. Yamaoka's original compositions are still present throughout. They blend seamlessly with the new atmosphere tracks that heighten the sense of dread. The sound effects, the team at Bloober have gone all out. The distant moans of creatures, the creaking of the metal and the dilapidated structures. They're much more detailed and immersive, and it amplifies that tension as you explore. It's probably one of the only games where I felt that the music, without it, the game would be very bland. It wouldn't be exactly the same as we see it and hear it. The voice acting in the remake is much more naturalistic compared to the original's somewhat stilted performances of its time. Whilst this helps modernise the storytelling, some fans, like myself as well, will miss that original slightly awkward delivery of the lines, which contributed again to that strange charm that the game had. The new voice performances are solid, but there is something about the old recordings that gave the game that eerie, otherworldly quality, which is somewhat lost now. This purely, again, comes down to personal preference, and some others might have other opinions on that. Let me know in the comments below what you guys think. But they are games and products of their time. If you go back to 2001, everyone thought it was amazing. And you compare that to this version of Silent Hill 2, everyone probably thinks this one's amazing, and new people will think this one's amazing in comparison. Again, it's something that's going to be personal to everyone, and you're all entitled to the opinion. On next, the performance. On PS5 and PC, Silent Hill 2 Remake generally runs well. The game targets 60 frames per second on higher end systems, though there are occasional dips during more graphically intense scenes, particularly when a lot of fog and lighting effects are present. I did notice it happens a lot when you look up. For some reason, the game gets this weird drop in frames. The PS5 version makes use of obviously the powerful hardware to deliver a pretty much stable performance with very minimal loading times. Very impressive graphical fidelity throughout, playing on performance mode. The graphics mode suffers slightly from the game's target frames hitting every time, and it's not always accurate. But hopefully this will get patched out, and it doesn't detract too much from the actual game itself. However, if you're playing on lower end PC systems, players may encounter some severe performance issues with the frame drops, the texture pop-ins, particularly in the more open areas. So you might need to dial back some of the graphical settings to make this gameplay a little bit smoother. Like I said, most of the time the issues I experienced were when you were looking up at the sky or in bigger open areas. There is an issue with ghosting throughout the game on all platforms. There's this weird ghosting effect, where it trails off. You guys, if you play the game, you'll know what I mean. It's a bizarre thing to see, but it's not a game ender. It's just one of those things. As requested, we have a bugs section in our review now. So the bugs, whilst most of the game is mostly polished, some players have reported encountering minor bugs and glitches. I've had a few happen to me with the occasional clipping issues where enemies or James get stuck in the environment. I myself lost 2 runs and had to reload a previous save due to being stuck on what was effectively nothing, floating in the air after attacking an enemy. James kind of does this forward move animation, and as he does that, sometimes he can get stuck on the environment and you cannot move. You are stuck in spot, and there's nothing you can do other than load. So you need to make sure you're making regular saves just in case something like that does happen. There are a couple of minor animation problems, such as stiff movement during some cutscenes and during some of the actual combat in the game. But whilst, again, most of these bugs are not game breaking, they kind of pull you out of that immersion, especially if you're just all of a sudden you're in this intense moment and then you're stuck on a ledge or an invisible wall. There are reports of audio desynchronization in certain cutscenes and a few instances of crashes on PC, though these seem to be very rare, and Bloober Team have been responsive in patching the game and getting it up to date, so hopefully that will be kind of ironed out post-launch and we can go from there. Final thoughts. So overall, my final thoughts on the Silent Hill 2 remake. It's a respectful and visually stunning reimagining of a beloved cult classic. Bloober Team has preserved the core narrative and atmosphere that made the original a landmark title in survival horror, whilst modernising the game's visuals, controls and accessibility for today's audience. For newcomers, this is a great way to experience one of the best psychological horror stories in gaming history. For long-time fans, it's a nostalgic return to Silent Hill, though some might miss the more unsettling quirks of the original and wish they had remade Silent Hill 1 as well. Whilst it doesn't take too many risks with gameplay innovations, the remake offers just enough improvements to justify its existence and stands as a worthy tribute to the original. And if you're a fan of survival horror or narrative-driven horror games, the Silent Hill 2 remake is well worth your time. Despite a few minor performance issues and bugs, it serves as a reminder of why Silent Hill 2 remains one of the most haunting and unforgettable games of all time. And here's hoping we do finally get a remake of Silent Hill 1 for modern consoles, and it doesn't get lost to the sands of time on PS1. Overall, the game clocked in at about 22 hours for the platinum. It wasn't too bad. Multiple playthroughs required. But other than that, we gave this game an 8 out of 10. Thanks very much, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Take care.